Hello and welcome to 9 to 5 Data, where we talk about data analytics. In the previous section, I've shown us the in and out of Power BI, how to connect with different data sources, what different visualization does, and the different menu on the Power BI ribbon, what it means. I've shown us that. So in this section, we're going to be talking about the Power Query and the Power Query editor, the data type in Power Query, and we move properly into transforming data in Power Query by performing text transformation, number and column calculation, data time calculation, and also we'll talk about the append and merge queries and also formatting data in Power BI and also looking at the data source settings and refresh settings. So let's get started. But before we do, don't forget to like, share, and comment on this video. And also, if you have not subscribed to this channel or you are seeing me for the first time, please do subscribe now. So what is Power Query Editor? Power Query Editor is a data container in Power BI where we transform our data by changing the data type, making changes to the column name, removing some rows, and formatting the data before we finally load it into Power BI. And it is important to do all these steps because data, they often come dirty from source. And by cleaning this data and doing this transformation, we'll be able to create an efficient report and visualization in Power BI. We also have to understand that the changes that we make to data in Power Query is not permanent to the data, because what Power Query does is that it takes a copy of the data we are working with and then make the changes on that copy and then load that to the Power BI. So it does not overwrite the data at source. Every transformation we do does not overwrite the data at source. So let's get started and import data into Power Query and start working in Power Query. So to do that, we'll go to our Power BI, and the first way to get data into Power BI, which I've explained earlier, is that you can start with this get data. For us, we are going to be using an Excel workbook and some CSV files to do this demonstration. The data is available for download and the link to that data is in the description. So click on Excel workbook and then we have to browse to where the data is. So for me, this is the name, which is the dimension tables, and click open. And the next thing is click on this next button. So right now, because this is an Excel workbook, we have Excel worksheets, which are like the data set or the table that we want to work with. So you can click on any of these. And the first thing is that, let me click on customer. This is the first one I want to bring in. And if I click on customer table, I'll get a preview of what the data set looks like. And once I'm okay with that, the next thing is that I'll come to the bottom right corner and there's option for me to cancel load. And then I want to actually transform this data before loading it. That is, I want to take it to Power Query before loading it. So if you click on load, it loads it directly into Power BI, but transform data then takes you to Power Query. Now we are in our Power Query editor, and if you have used this in Excel, this will most definitely look familiar. On our Power Query editor, we have the ribbon with the different menus that we have seen before. We have the home, we have the transform, we have the hard column, the view, tools, and help. So most of them will be explaining and most of them are really self-explanatory. So we'll go through each of these subsections of the menu one after the other to actually see what they do. But before we start to talk about the menu one after the other, so let's look at the screen, what we have on the screen. So we see that our screen is actually partitioned into like three sections or three areas. So to the left hand side, we have what we call the queries, and we have something like a table icon, which is the name of the data set or table that we've imported. And for Power BI, query means the same thing as table. So in this tutorial, I'll be interchanging queries and tables. So if I say queries, it means tables. And if I say tables, it means queries. So, and to the middle, we have a preview of the data set, which you can see the columns that we have in our data set. So for this customer data set, we have the customer ID, city, state, latitude, longitude, and we can also see the data type of each of the column, and there's something we also call column profile. And if you go to the top of this section, we have the formula bar, which looks familiar or similar to what we have in Excel. But this is actually different because this is what we call M coding. So if I click on this drop down arrow, you can actually see what this is telling us. So this is known as M code, and Power BI is a great documentation on how to read this. But for the purpose of this video, we are not going to go into M coding, as Power BI has provided us a way to actually work with Power Query without needing to write this code in details. And if you look to the bottom of our table, you will see what we call column profiling, which will tell us the number of rows that has been loaded or previewed in the dataset and how many columns the dataset contains. So you might be wondering, if I don't understand this M code, then how am I going to do transformation in Power Query? So Power Query allows us to apply transformation visually, and every transformation we applied is saved into a place called the applied steps. So if you look to the right hand side, we see there are two options there. In our query settings section, we'll see the properties and the applied steps. So before I talk about the applied steps, let's talk about the properties. So this is where we make changes to the properties of the data set, like the name of the data set, which is customers right now. And I can click into this box and change it to customer table. And when I click outside, by checking the query section, you can see that the name has changed to customer table. And also, there are additional properties that we can change. If you click on all these properties, then this will give us option again to change the customer table name that we have just given, or we can add description to it. And there's option of enable load to report. And what this does for us is that it loads our dataset, this particular dataset, into Power BI. So if you untick this, then this particular dataset would not be loaded into Power BI. And automatically it has untick include in report refresh. And what this means is that this dataset is no longer going to be refreshed, even though there's a new or there's a latest dataset for it, it's not going to be refreshed. So when we tick this back, because we will need it in our report, then everything comes back again. So you can also untick this include in report refresh alone. And what this is going to do is that it will ensure that we get our data into Power BI, but it's not going to always have the latest data. So we don't need to make any changes to this right now. So let's just click include in report refresh and then click OK. So the next category or the next subsection we want to talk about here is the applied step. So like I told you that we can apply transformation visually in Power Query. Once you do any transformation, it becomes an applied steps, which then gets added to the list of the applied steps that we are seeing here. And by default, there are some steps that have automatically been applied to our data set. So for example, the source step, and if you click on the source steps, you can see that it will take us back to the source of the data. And if you look at the formula bar, we have the Excel workbook. That is where the data is coming from, to the name of the Excel workbook, and then sheets that are contained. This is what is showing us now, the sheets that are contained. And if you remember, we selected the customer data set. If you go to navigation, then it's going to tell you that we navigated into customer table. And the next thing Power BI did was to promote the header. That is this first row, it made it the column head, and then change the data type. So that is all the applied transformation that we have here now. So visually, you change anything, then it gets added to the list of applied step. So, and if we right click the query name, the same property settings that we have access to before, we can also get to do it from here. You see there's option to copy, delete, rename, enable load, include in report refresh, duplicate, reference, and everything, which we are going to talk about most of this in the later part of this video. So the next thing is that we have to start looking at the ribbon of this Power Query editor. So when we go to the home menu, the first subsection that we have there is the close, which has this drop down icon to it. And we have option for close and apply, apply and close. So close and apply, what it does is that it closes this Power Query editor and it applies all the pending changes that we have done to our data set or to our tables or queries. So for the apply, so what it only does is that it applied any pending changes without closing the Power Query editor. But close, on the other side, closes the Power Query editor without applying the pending changes. So we usually come to this point when we are done with our transformation, and the next thing we do is just come to close and apply when we are done with our transformation. So let's move to the next subsection, which is the new query subsection. We have the new source button and we have the recent source button and also enter data. So I've talked about enter data several times in previous videos, so I'm not going to be bothering myself about this. So we now move to the first button, which is the new source. And if you click on the drop down, we've already seen this before. That is, we can connect to a new data source. So this is having a new design. So let me just show you this. And when you have this now, you can choose a lot of data sources to connect to. By default, we'll always be on the home button and we can click on new and it will display all the data sources that Power BI or Power Query support. So the next thing is that we have recent data source, which will show us all the data source that we have connected to in the previous section or in the previous project. So if you are just using Power BI or Power Query for the first time, you might not get any previous data source. But if you have connected before to Dimension table dataset, then you should see this. So we have one link catalog, which allows you to connect to fabric item, and we have the blank table, which I have explained before, and the blank query is where we use the M code to then bring data into Power BI or Power Query. So right now, since we are not talking about M code, this is not something we want to discuss. So if we go to new again, I want to bring in a CSV file into our Power Query. So what I'm going to do, click on that and then browse to the location of the CSV file. So you should get access to it if you've downloaded the data set, which is freight, and click open. So the next, click on next. For CSV file, you will definitely see that the option is different from when we connected to Excel file. So this right now, sometimes you can make changes to the settings at the top, but I would advise you leave it the way it is, because by default, Power Query would actually detect the origin of the file, which is the encoding of the CSV. There are different encoding, and also it will detect automatically the delimiter. So for example, our delimiter is comma. So there could be maybe tab or space for delimiter. So, but for this data set that we're bringing in, the delimiter is comma, and also it's going to detect the data type by the first 200 rows. So if you feel like maybe that is not enough, then you can also increase it, maybe based on the entire data set. But it's going to also affect your performance. If you put it on based on the entire data set, this is going to affect your performance. And you can also set it to do not detect any data type. So based on the way your data is set up. So for now, I'll just say we go with the default settings. So come to the load and click on the drop down icon and click on transform data so that it gets sent into our Power Query editor. And right now we can see the columns that are inside this freight data set. So that is how to use a new source to bring in data into Power Query. And also, if we go back to our subsection, the new query subsection, we have the recent sources, which this is going to show us the different data sources we've connected to in the past. So say, for example, in this dimension table, I want to bring in more data set from that Excel file. If I click on it, then it takes me to the Excel file. And I can bring in more data sets. So say, for example, let me click on this driver, this, and this. So I already brought in this customer data, so there's no point in bringing it again. So click on OK, and then they become part of the queries. Now let's move to the next subsection, which is the data source, and it has the data source settings. So if you click on this is where you come to manage the settings of your data sources. And initially, when you look at this window, there are two options. That is the data source in the current file that we are working with, or the global permission. So let's talk about the one that we are working with. In the data source in the current file, we have two data sources right now. We have the Excel file and we have the CSV file that we have connected to. And right now we are selecting the Excel file and we can change the source. We usually do this if the Excel file has been moved from the default location, or sometimes somebody sent us a Power BI that is powered by an Excel file. So once that is sent to us, we have to also change the paths into the Excel file on our own system or on our own device. So right now, this is okay. So I'm not changing anything. I'm just showing you what it means. And the same thing goes for the CSV. You can also change the source if it has changed. And you can change the source, change it to anything. And also you can change the delimiter if there's any changes on that. And also we have the permission to export this and also edit the permission and also clear the permission. But for the global permission, what we usually do for the global permission is that you have access, or you see a list of data sources that you have connected to in the past projects that you have done, and you can either clear the permission for them. That is, your Power BI will no longer have the connection to these data sources. You have to reconnect again, or you can edit the permission. Maybe the security settings have changed. So this is what we do with data sources settings. So we come here to manage the settings of our data sources, the connection parameters or permissions. So let's close this. So the next subsection is the parameters. Parameters allows you to create dynamic values that can be reused across your entire queries or your data set. So if we look at this now, we have these options, the drop-down menu where you can manage parameters. These parameters is grayed out because we don't have a parameter in our data set right now. And we have the new parameter. So before we do that, let me give us an example. So if you go to this freight table, so we have the date column. Say, for example, I want to filter this date column to a particular date. Instead of coming here and always doing that manually, I can actually create a parameter and then I can dynamically change the date I want. So let's do that now. Let's go to manage parameters and click on the drop down and I click on new parameter. So once I click on new parameters, I get this window where the first thing for me is the parameter name. So I can give it a name, any name I want. So let me make it date. Let me say start date. And there's a description. I can say change freight date dynamically. And then the next settings here now is the type. So you can change the type. So because I'm very sure of the type I want, which is date, I'll change it to date. And suggested value, leave it at any value. And the current value, sometimes you can leave it blank and sometimes you can give it a default value. So let me say I actually want to change this to a date of, let's say, the 13th. Let me do 23rd of January and do 2018. So once I click OK, this will be added to list of queries, and you can see now that I have my parameter with the name on the list of query. And also there's now an option of manage parameters for me. So I will talk about that later. So let's go back to our freight table. And if I click here, like to filter, go back to date filter, and let me say equals to. So Clicking on this option, then I can click on that I want the date to equal to a parameter value. So if I click on parameter value, automatically it will detect the parameter that I've created, which is the start date. And it would then filter to the date, the default date we've set in our parameter. If I click OK, this should filter the date to 23rd of January 2018, as you can see. And the next thing again is that if I come to this place now, to this manage parameters, now there are options of manage parameters and edit parameter. So if I manage parameter, it will take me back to the point where we started the creation of the parameter. Like if I feel like changing or deleting the parameter entirely, or changing the data type or the current value, or changing anything there, that is what manage parameter does. And for now, I'll just cancel that because I'm not changing anything. If I feel like I want to change this date, the next thing I'm going to do is to come to manage parameter and click on edit parameter. So automatically it detects the start date, and by hovering on it will give us the description we gave at the start of creating this parameter, which is change flight date dynamically. And if I change this one, let me say I'm changing it to 19th of January, and I click OK. So automatically nothing is happening because this is preview results. So if I click on another query and I go back to my phrase, so that would automatically have resolved itself. So it has refreshed and now it is showing 19th of January 2018. So every data set in this now, or the records are all filtered to 19th of January 2018. And right now, if I want to cancel this filter, I don't need this filter, I just go to the apply step on the right, and you can see that these steps has been applied for me. And one thing I usually do as a Power BI developer is that anytime I'm doing I'm applying a transformation and this steps has been created, what I do is right click on this and then rename this. You see there are many options. I can edit the settings of this, rename this, delete until a particular value, or delete until a particular step to the end of the step, or insert step after, or move up or move down, and extract the previous one, diagnose, and the properties of this. So you can edit this and it will just go back to like we are trying to filter, and that is okay. I'm not changing anything here. Click on cancel. And if I right click on this, I can rename this. So most of the time what I do is that I can change this to filter rule. So to know what I've done, and say date filtered to 19th of January 2018. So once anybody is going through my applied transformation, they can actually see what is happening in each of these transformation. And also again, I have the properties of these, which I can click on these and then add a description to these steps. I filtered this date to 19/01/2018 because this is the actual date, actual start date. And I click OK. So if you hover on this, then you get to see the description, which is I filtered this date to 19/01/2018 because this is the actual date. So this is a good practice when we are doing applied transformation. We don't just go with the default name that Power Query has given us. We try to make it better, because if you are developing as a team, it will also help your team to know what is happening in this particular step. So that is for the applied step. And if this is no longer needed, what I do is just click on this X, and then it goes back to the normal way the data set has always been. So that is everything about the parameters subsection. And moving on to the next subsection, we have the output data, which allows us to export. We have this button, export query result. And if you click on this, it allows you to export the query or the table to a particular destination. So you have a lot of destination. It's just more of like, when we are picking from a data source. So we can also pick a lot of data destination that we want to export the data to. But for me personally, I've not seen any use for this. So I've never used this. So I'll just click on cancel to go back. To the next subsection, we have the query subsection. And in the query subsection, we have the refresh preview, we have the properties button, we have the advanced editor, and we have the manage. So for the refresh preview, so what we have right now is that we have this drop icon beside it, and we have this three button where we can refresh the preview result of these data sets in view, or we can refresh the preview result of the entire data set or the entire queries or the entire table. Like I said, queries and table means the same thing. And we can cancel refresh. Sometimes if you're trying to refresh the preview result of the entire queries, it usually takes longer than expected, and that consumes resources. And if you don't need that, you can cancel that. So how do we use this one? So remember when I was using this parameter, if I click on this and I try to filter to this parameter, so let me do parameter and this and click OK. So remember, this is 2018, and if I go to manage parameters and I click on edit parameter and I make this 23rd, I click OK, nothing is happening because this result preview has not been refreshed. So that is why we are still seeing the old result. And you remember, I was able to refresh this by going from one query to another. So instead of doing that, I just click on this, refresh the preview result of this query, and then it brings us to the latest data or the latest transformation that has been applied. So that is how to use the refresh preview. So, and if we go to the property button, so we have seen this before. It's just changing the properties of this particular data set, and I've explained all those. So going to advanced editor would actually show us the M code that makes up this data set. And if you understand M code, you can start to script your transformation using the M code. But for now, we are not doing anything. And you can also try and make changes. If you understand M code, you can make changes to this place, and any changes you make, you click on done, and that will be applied. That you will see that in your applied steps. So for managing now, we can actually manage these data sets by, sometimes you can delete these. So say for example, if I go to this place, I don't really need them. I can just click on, I don't need this vehiculo because it's the same thing as vehicle, it's just a different language. I'll just click on delete, and then that is going to disappear from the list of queries that I have. Same things for this one. I can right click on this and say delete. So it goes away. So most of the buttons that we have available on the query subsection, we can also get access to them by right clicking. So right now we have this duplicate and reference. So duplicate and reference are very important thing we need to understand. A lot of beginners get confused when it comes to this because duplicate and reference looks like they are doing the same thing, but they are not. So if we go to our driver dataset and I right click on this and I click on duplicate, so what this has done for me is that it has taken a copy of this driver and then added it to the list of queries that I have. So if you go back to this and this, you see that they are the same thing except that the names are different. So that is for duplicate. It takes the copy of the query and reproduces it. But when we do reference is actually different from duplicate in the sense that reference produces a new table with the source being the table where we referenced it from. So if you look at this now and you look at the applied step and we look at the formula bar, you can see that the source is the driver, which is the table we referenced it from. So, and if you look at our driver 2, the source is actually from our Excel file. If you click on it, the source is actually from our Excel file. So the difference between the two is from their sources. If you reference the table and you make changes to the source table, the changes is reflected to the referenced data. So say for example, if I look at this now, this driver ID, and I just click on the data set, and let me make this a fixed decimal. Let me say this is a decimal number, and just add a new step. And if we go to our driver 3, you can see now that the data type has also changed to 1.2 that I changed it to in the main data set, which is the decimal number. So the data type is also the decimal number. And if I change it back again, so let me go to this and just cancel the change. And this goes back to O number. You can see this goes back to O number. So if we go back to the driver, you see now that it goes back to the O number. So that is the difference between reference and duplicated data set or queries. So moving on to the next subsection, we have the manage column, which has two buttons, which is choose column and remove column. So let's talk about the first one, which is the choose column, which has this drop down icon of choose column or go to column. So before we talk about that, let me go back to my freight table to explain this. If we click on this drop down of choose column, so this is actually used when you have a list of columns you want to keep, but you have a very large data set with very large column. So if you click on this choose column, it will list the columns in your data set or in your queries, and you can actually just check the one you want to keep. So if, for example, I want freight ID, city, and then net revenue. If I click OK, the rest of the columns disappeared and I'm left with the ones that I just need to use. And that is how to use the choose column. So I can just cancel this again and I'll be back to the main data set that we have. Let me cancel this filter too. So the other one again is that we have the go to column. So go to column is actually used when you have a very large data set also and you are finding it difficult to navigate to a particular column. So say for example, I just want to go to the city column, and by scrolling around, it was difficult finding that. I can go to the city, I can just type city and select it, and then it becomes the focused column in my data set or in my query. So that is how to use the choose column. So we have the remove column, which the name, we know what that is going to be doing from the name. We can use this to remove a particular column. So for example, in our data set, we have the weight in kg and we have the weight in cubic. So I don't need this cubic weight. So what I can do is that I can click on this and then come to remove column and then click on remove the column. So this is going to remove the selected column and you see that that is gone already. So I now have the weight in kg only. So I can click on this remove again to get back the cubic. For the second option, we have remove order. So say for example, I want to keep my freight ID only on this data set. Instead of going one after the other by right clicking and removing, so what I can do is that click on this freight ID and then go to remove columns, drop down and click on remove other columns. So other columns will disappear except the freight ID. So those are the functionalities that we can do with the remove column button. And moving on to the next subsection, which is the reduce rows. So it's actually similar to the column. So this is just working on the rows. So we have options to keep rows and we have options to remove rows. So the first one, which is the keep rows, we have keep top rows. If you click on this, then you can specify the number of rows you want to keep. I can say I want to keep the top 10 rows. And if I click OK, this is going to keep the top 10 rows and delete the rest. So that is that. And also you can keep the bottom rows or keep range of rows. If you click on keep range of rows, then you can specify the first row and the number of rows you want to keep. Say for example, I want to do it from the 13th row, which is 21341 customer ID, and up to the 15th row, which is 1989 customer ID. So I'm going to do 13 and then number of rows from 13, 14, 15. So I'm keeping 3 rows and just click OK. And you can see now that we have 21341 and to the customer ID of 1989. So that is for keeping rows. So, and let me go back to the main data set. So we have keep duplicate, and this is straightforward. It keeps the duplicate in our data set or in the selected column. So keep errors also keep the errors that we have in the selected columns, and errors can arise from maybe things like mismatched data types or some other issues in our data set. And we also have the remove rows, which this one is similar to the keep rows that we've explained. So it removes top rows, remove bottom rows. So you give it a number of rows you want to remove and it removes them. And you can also remove duplicates. So we are bringing in large data sets into Power BI that could contain duplicates. This can be removed with just one button of remove duplicate in Power Query. And we also have remove blank rows or remove errors that are in our data set. So the last one that we'll be talking about in this Power Query introduction is the sort subsection, which allows us to sort our column from the lowest to the highest or from the highest to the lowest. Say, for example, I look at my truck ID, I've selected the column, and I can click on sorting it from the lowest to the highest, and you can see that. And if I cancel this again and click on sort from the highest to the lowest, so we can also see that. So those are the subsections that we're going to be talking about in this home tab. We still have the transformation subsection and the combine, which we'll be explaining in the transformation menu. So in this video, we've gotten an introduction to Power Query, and we have seen the home menu where we talked about how to bring in data into Power BI and make some changes to the data by working on the rows and the column of the data, and also seeing the properties of the queries that we brought into Power BI. So in the next video, we'll start to look at transformation in Power BI. And if you have not subscribed to this channel, please do so and subscribe now. And don't forget to like, share, and comment on this video. See you in the next video.